Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's emotional sci-fi story, I'd love to ask for your support. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Your engagement really helps the channel grow. Now let's get into this incredible tale. The orbital station hummed with the constant rhythm of life, a symphony of footsteps, automated announcements, and the distant whir of ventilation systems pushing recycled air through kilometers of corridors. Gateway Station 7 floated in the neutral zone between Earth's solar influence and the sprawling territories of the Galactic Council, a crossroads where species from dozens of worlds intersected for trade, diplomacy, and the messy business of coexistence. The year was 2025, and humanity had been part of the galactic community for barely 3 decades, long enough to establish themselves as reliable engineers and traders, but still considered newcomers by civilizations that counted their histories in millennia. In the lower maintenance bay of the station's western quadrant, Riley Ortega wiped grease from her hands onto a rag that had long since surrendered to permanent staining. The 42-year-old mechanic had been stationed on Gateway 7 for nearly 5 years, maintaining the aging infrastructure that kept thousands of inhabitants breathing, eating, and moving through the artificial gravity wells. Her small workshop was tucked between the primary coolant recyclers and a cargo bay that serviced the smaller transport vessels, a location most beings on the station never noticed or cared about. Riley preferred it that way. She had left Earth after her divorce, seeking distance from memories that clung to every familiar street corner. The station offered anonymity and purpose, broken things that needed fixing, problems with clear solutions, and the comforting solitude of machinery that never judged or disappointed. Her days followed predictable patterns: diagnostic runs at dawn cycle, repair work through midday, parts inventory before evening, and the occasional emergency call when something critical failed in the station's vast mechanical nervous system. The maintenance bay reflected its occupant, organized chaos that made sense only to those who understood its internal logic. Tool racks lined the walls, each implement returned to its designated spot with religious consistency. Diagnostic tablets rested on a workbench, scarred by years of impact marks and chemical stains. In the corner, a small fabrication unit hummed quietly, printing replacement components for systems too old to have spare parts readily available. Riley had installed a portable heating unit near her primary workspace, combating the perpetual chill that seeped through the station's lower levels, where insulation had degraded beyond optimal function. She was deep into rebuilding a malfunctioning servo motor when the crying started. At first, Riley dismissed it as another audio artifact. The station's aging hull occasionally transmitted sounds in strange ways, creating acoustic ghosts that seemed to emanate from empty corridors. But this sound persisted, a high-pitched keening that resonated with something undeniably organic, undeniably distressed. Riley set down her calibration tool and listened. The crying came from somewhere beyond her workshop, possibly from the adjacent cargo bay or one of the service corridors that branched off the main thoroughfare. She stood, joints protesting after 3 hours crouched over the workbench, and moved toward the bay's secondary entrance. The corridor outside was dimly lit, as most lower-level passages were between peak traffic hours. Emergency lighting cast long shadows that seemed to stretch and contract with each flicker of the overhead panels. Riley followed the sound, her work boots echoing against the metal flooring. The crying grew louder as she approached a service alcove typically used for temporary storage of equipment, waiting for disposal or recycling. There, huddled behind a stack of decommissioned atmospheric processors, was a child. Riley's first impression registered the species markers that 3 decades of human-alien contact had made familiar to most spacefaring humans. The girl, Riley assumed female from the clothing and body structure, though alien biology often defied Earth-based gender categories, appeared to be from the Karethi species. Her skin held the characteristic pale blue-gray coloration that darkened toward purple around the joints and extremities. Large eyes, disproportionately sized compared to her small face, shimmered with bioluminescent tears that left faint trails down her cheeks. She stood no taller than a human 6-year-old, though Riley knew Corethi aged differently, and determining actual age without medical scanning remained unreliable. The child's clothing was filthy and torn in several places. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, what looked like a worn blanket wrapped around something Riley couldn't identify. The girl's breathing came in ragged gasps between sobs, and when she noticed Riley's approach, she pressed herself further into the corner, eyes wide with terror. Riley stopped several feet away, crouching to reduce her height advantage. She had limited experience with children. Her marriage had ended before those plans materialized, and even less experience with alien juveniles. But fear was universal, recognizable across species barriers, and this child radiated it like heat from an overloaded circuit. "Hey," Riley said softly, keeping her hands visible and non-threatening. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl didn't respond, didn't show any sign of understanding. Of course not, Riley realized. The child was probably too young for the neural translators most adults used for cross-species communication. The Corethi spoke in a language that combined vocal sounds with subtle color shifts in their skin, a dual-channel communication method that human vocal cords couldn't replicate, and most translation technology struggled to render accurately. Riley slowly reached for the communication tablet secured to her belt. The device was standard issue for maintenance personnel, equipped with basic translation protocols for the most common languages represented on Gateway 7. She activated the child-friendly interface, a simplified program designed for emergency situations involving juveniles who might not have full language capabilities yet. The tablet emitted a soft, soothing tone, then displayed a series of simple images, pictographs representing basic concepts like safety, food, help. Riley held it where the girl could see, pointing to the safety icon. The child's enormous eyes flicked between Riley and the tablet. Her crying had quieted to hitching breaths, though fear still dominated her expression. One small hand reached out tentatively toward the device, then jerked back as if she expected punishment for the gesture. Something in that flinch struck Riley deeply, stirring memories she preferred to keep buried. She recognized the body language of a being who had learned to expect pain, who had been taught that reaching for comfort led only to disappointment, or worse. "It's okay," Riley repeated, knowing the words meant nothing but hoping her tone conveyed what language couldn't. She tapped the tablet screen, causing the safety icon to expand and emit another gentle tone. Then she pointed to herself and made an exaggerated friendly gesture, something between a wave and a welcoming motion. The girl watched with intensity that seemed too old for such a small being. Slowly, hesitantly, she uncurled slightly from her defensive posture. The bundle she clutched shifted, and Riley glimpsed what appeared to be a stuffed toy, or perhaps a Corethi equivalent, so worn that its original features had faded to abstraction. Riley sat down on the cold floor, ignoring the protests from her knees. She set the tablet between them like a bridge. "I'm Riley," she said, pointing to herself again. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The word parents caused an immediate reaction. The girl's bioluminescent tears intensified, spilling down her cheeks in glowing rivulets. Her mouth opened in a wail that needed no translation, the universal sound of a child crying for someone who would never answer. Riley's chest tightened. She had heard that sound before, in her childhood, from the foster system that had shaped her formative years before the Ortega family finally provided a permanent home. It was the sound of abandonment, of loss too large for a small being to contain. Without thinking, Riley extended her hand, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. Her palm lay open on the metal floor between them, an invitation without expectation. The girl stared at that hand for what felt like an eternity. Her sobbing continued, but something shifted in her posture. Slowly, with the caution of prey approaching a potential threat, she reached out. Her small blue-grey fingers, no larger than a human toddler's, touched Riley's palm. The contact was feather-light, barely perceptible, but the moment their skin connected, the girl's expression transformed. The terror didn't vanish, but it shared space with something else. Hope, perhaps, or the desperate need to believe that not all large beings meant harm. Riley gently closed her fingers around the child's hand, creating a protective cocoon rather than a grip. "I've got you," she murmured. "You're safe now, I promise." The girl collapsed forward, pressing her small body against Riley's legs, her free hand still clutching the worn bundle. Her crying intensified briefly, the release of someone who had been holding everything together until safety finally appeared, before gradually subsiding into exhausted hiccups. Riley sat there on the cold corridor floor, one hand holding the alien child's tiny fingers, the other hovering uncertainly, before settling gently on the girl's back. She could feel the rapid heartbeat through the thin clothing, could sense the trembling that spoke of cold and fear and exhaustion. Above them, the station continued its endless cycle. Thousands of beings moving through their daily routines, completely unaware of this moment happening in a forgotten corner of the lower maintenance levels. Riley knew she should contact station security, should report finding an unaccompanied minor, should activate the protocols designed for exactly this situation. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the child gripped her hand with desperate strength. Maybe it was the memory of her own childhood being processed through systems that cared more about procedure than people. Maybe it was simply the mechanic in her recognizing something broken that needed fixing, something precious that deserved more care than bureaucratic efficiency could provide. "Come on," Riley said softly, gently disengaging enough to stand while keeping the girl's hand in hers. "Let's get you somewhere warmer, somewhere safe, and then we'll figure out what happens next." The child looked up at her, those enormous bioluminescent eyes still wet with tears, but now containing a fragile thread of trust. She didn't resist, as Riley slowly led her back toward the maintenance bay, small fingers wrapped around the human's calloused hand like a lifeline. The workshop felt different with another presence in it. Riley had grown so accustomed to solitude that she had forgotten how space contracted and expanded with the addition of another being. The girl stood uncertainly just inside the doorway, still clutching her bundle, eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment with wary alertness. Riley guided her toward the small rest area she had created in the corner, a battered but comfortable chair salvaged from a decommissioned crew quarters, a small table, and an aging food processing unit that Riley had personally rebuilt to function better than its factory specifications. She retrieved a thermal blanket from her emergency supply locker, the kind designed to work across multiple species' temperature requirements, and wrapped it around the child's narrow shoulders. The girl accepted the blanket, but didn't relax. She watched Riley's every movement with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety could evaporate in an instant. Riley pulled up a second chair, a workshop stool actually, and sat at the girl's eye level. She reactivated the translation tablet, navigating to more complex pictographs, food, water, rest, basic needs that transcended language. She pointed to each icon, then to the girl, making the question clear. The child nodded hesitantly at the water icon. Riley moved to the sink, filling a clean container with filtered water. Karithi could consume human-safe water. That much she remembered from the basic xenobiology briefings all station personnel received. She brought it back, placing it on the table within reach, but not forcing it into the girl's hands. The child stared at the water, then at Riley, as if expecting some hidden cost to accepting it. When no demand came, she tentatively picked up the container with both hands and drank in small, careful sips. Some of the tension left her small frame as the liquid eased what must have been significant thirst. "Good," Riley said encouragingly. "That's good. You must be hungry too, right?" She stood and moved to the food processor, keeping the movements slow and predictable. The unit's database contained nutritional profiles for most known species in the Galactic Council. Riley selected the Karethi juvenile option, and the machine hummed to life, synthesizing a meal designed for the girl's dietary requirements. Within minutes, a bowl of something that resembled a thick porridge emerged, steam rising from its surface. Riley brought it back with a spoon. Karethi used similar utensils, thankfully, and set it on the table. The smell seemed to trigger something in the child because her eyes widened and her small body leaned forward involuntarily before she caught herself and pulled back. "It's yours," Riley assured her, pushing the bowl closer. "Go ahead." The girl ate with the controlled desperation of someone who had gone hungry too often. She consumed every bite, scraping the bowl clean with methodical determination. Riley watched, her heart aching with questions she couldn't ask, and answers the child couldn't give. When the food was gone, the girl's eyelids began to droop. Whatever adrenaline had sustained her was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Riley noticed her swaying slightly in the chair. "Tired?" Riley asked unnecessarily. She pointed to the rest icon on the tablet, then to the chair. "You can sleep here. You're safe." The child's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She clutched her bundle tighter, the worn fabric compressing under her fingers. But when Riley adjusted the chair to recline and added another blanket, the temptation of rest proved too strong to resist. The girl curled into the chair, finally releasing her grip on Riley's hand, but keeping the human in her line of sight. "I'll be right here," Riley said, pointing to her workbench only a few meters away. "Right here the whole time. I won't leave." She didn't know if the child understood the words, but something in her tone must have conveyed the meaning. The girl's eyes closed, though her breathing remained shallow and alert for several more minutes before finally deepening into genuine sleep. Riley returned to her workbench, but the servo motor repair held no interest anymore. She pulled up her station communication terminal, hesitating over the security contact interface. Protocol demanded she report this. An unaccompanied alien minor represented a significant situation requiring official intervention. There would be questions about the child's origin, searches for guardians or relatives, involvement of the Karethi embassy staff. But Riley had seen how station bureaucracy worked. The child would be processed through multiple departments, interviewed by officials who followed procedures rather than instincts, possibly placed in temporary holding facilities while her status was determined. And if no guardians could be located, if she truly was orphaned, the child would enter the galactic equivalent of foster care, systems that meant well, but operated on efficiency rather than compassion. Riley remembered those systems. She remembered the succession of temporary homes, the caseworkers who knew her name but not her story, the feeling of being a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cared for. She remembered the loneliness, the fear, the desperate hope that each new placement might finally be the place where she belonged. And she remembered the Ortegas, the family who had seen past the defensive walls and the behavioral reports, who had offered not just a home, but belonging. They had saved her in every way that mattered. Riley looked at the sleeping child, so small and vulnerable in the too large chair. She thought about making the call that would set bureaucratic wheels in motion. Her finger hovered over the communication button. She didn't press it. Not yet, she told herself. Not until the child was rested, until she could at least try to understand the girl's situation better. 24 hours wouldn't make a significant difference in any official investigation, but it might make all the difference to a terrified child who had finally found someone willing to hold her hand. Riley closed the communication interface and returned to her work. The servo motor wasn't going to repair itself, and keeping busy would prevent her from overthinking a decision she knew carried consequences. She worked quietly, aware of the small presence sleeping nearby, feeling an unfamiliar weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. Outside the maintenance bay, Gateway Station 7 continued its endless rotation, but inside that small workshop, something had shifted. A mechanic who had come to space to escape connection had found herself connected anyway, bound by a small hand's desperate grip and a child's silent plea for safety. Riley didn't know what came next, but she knew with certainty that surprised her that she wasn't going to abandon this child to the impersonal machinery of systems and protocols. Whatever happened, wherever this situation led, she would be there, right there, just as she had promised. The girl slept on, her breathing finally peaceful, and Riley worked through the night, keeping watch over someone who had somehow, impossibly, become her responsibility. The child woke 3 hours later with a startled gasp, her body tensing as consciousness returned and unfamiliar surroundings registered. Riley was at her side within seconds, moving from her workbench with speed that surprised them both. "Hey, it's okay," Riley said softly, keeping her voice calm and level. "You're safe. Remember, we met in the corridor." The girl's wide eyes found Riley's face, and recognition slowly replaced panic. She sat up in the chair, the thermal blanket sliding off her shoulders, and looked around the workshop with more awareness than she had shown earlier. Her small hands immediately checked for the worn bundle, still clutched against her chest, and some of the tension left her frame when she confirmed its presence. Riley retrieved the translation tablet and activated it. This time, she navigated to a section designed for basic communication exchange, not just pictographs, but simple phrases in multiple languages. The device had a learning function that could adapt to individual speech patterns if given enough samples. She held it where the girl could see and tapped the greeting sequence. The tablet displayed a simple image of two beings meeting, accompanied by soft tones that approximated a Karithi greeting pattern. Then it prompted for a response. The child watched the screen with intense concentration. After a long moment, she touched the tablet with one small finger, tentatively exploring the interface. When nothing bad happened, she grew bolder, pressing the icon that indicated understanding. Progress, Riley thought. Small, but real. She worked through several more basic exchanges, confirming the girl felt physically okay, wasn't in pain, understood that she was in a safe location. The child's responses were hesitant but consistent. Whatever trauma she had experienced hadn't completely shut down her ability to communicate. Riley attempted the question she most needed answered, selecting the icon sequence for home and location. "Where are you from? Where is your family?" The girl's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her small body curled inward, arms wrapping around herself, and the bioluminescent tears began flowing again. She shook her head violently, her whole frame trembling with distress. Okay, Riley said quickly, setting the tablet aside and instinctively reaching out to comfort the child. "We don't have to talk about that now, it's okay." But the girl was caught in whatever memories the question had triggered. Her keening cry filled the workshop, a sound of such profound grief that Riley felt it in her chest. She knelt beside the chair, offering her hand the way she had in the corridor. The child latched onto it with both of her small hands, gripping with surprising strength. Riley carefully maneuvered herself onto the chair beside her, creating a protective space with her body. The girl immediately pressed against her, seeking the comfort of physical contact. "I've got you," Riley murmured, wrapping an arm around the small shoulders. "Whatever happened, you're safe now, I promise." They sat that way for a long time, the child crying against Riley's work coveralls, while the human simply held her. Riley had no idea what this girl had experienced, what had left her alone and terrified in a station corridor, but she understood loss intimately enough to recognize its manifestation. Eventually, the sobbing quieted to hiccuping breaths. The girl remained pressed against Riley, exhausted from emotional purging. Riley shifted slightly to grab the water container and brought it to the child's lips. She drank gratefully, some of the dehydration from crying easing with each sip. "Better?" Riley asked gently. The girl nodded minutely against her shoulder. She didn't pull away from the embrace, though, and Riley didn't try to force separation. They simply existed together in that moment, two beings from different worlds, connected by the universal language of comfort and care. Riley's mind churned through possibilities. An orphan? That seemed most likely. Either the girl's family had died recently, or she had been abandoned. Neither option was good, but they carried different implications for what came next. If her family had died, there might be records, embassy notifications, relatives searching for her. If she had been abandoned, the situation became more complex and potentially darker. She needed information, but clearly the direct approach caused too much distress. Riley decided to try a different strategy. She gently disengaged from the embrace enough to retrieve her personal tablet. Different from the translation device, this one held her own files and entertainment. She pulled up a simple picture gallery, images she had collected over the years of various repairs and station life. "Want to see something?" she asked, showing the screen to the girl. The child's attention shifted to the images, curiosity momentarily overriding distress. Riley scrolled slowly through pictures of machinery, station corridors, the observation deck's view of local space. The girl watched with rapt attention, occasionally pointing at something that interested her. When they reached an image of Riley standing with a group of other mechanics during a station maintenance celebration, the girl touched the screen, specifically tapping Riley's image. "That's me," Riley confirmed, "from about 2 years ago. See, we were celebrating finishing a major repair project." The child looked between the image and Riley's face, making the connection. Then she touched her own chest and made a questioning sound. Not quite words, but clear intent. "You?" Riley asked. "You want to show me a picture of you?" The girl nodded, then hesitated. She clutched her worn bundle, seeming to debate something internally. Finally, with careful, reverent movements, she unfolded the outer layer of fabric. Inside wasn't a toy, as Riley had assumed. It was a small digital storage chip, the universal standard used across most of the Galactic Council for personal data. The girl held it up, offering it to Riley with a gesture that conveyed both trust and desperate need. "You want me to access this?" Riley asked, pointing to the chip and then to her tablet. Another nod. More emphatic this time. Riley took the chip carefully, treating it with the reverence the child's body language indicated it deserved. She inserted it into her tablet's reader port, and after a moment of initialization, files appeared on the screen. Images. Dozens of them. A Karethi family, 2 adults and this child, younger but unmistakably the same girl. The photographs showed happy moments, celebrations, daily life, casual intimacy of a family unit. The girl was smiling in most of them, her bioluminescent eyes bright with joy rather than tears. The child pointed to the adult figures, touching each one with gentle fingers against the screen. Her mouth formed sounds that might have been names, though Riley's ears couldn't pass the Karethi phonemes. Then she looked up at Riley with an expression that needed no translation. "They're gone," that look said. "These people are gone, and I'm alone." Riley's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." She continued scrolling through the images at the girl's direction. More family moments, but also something else. Official-looking documents with Galactic Council seals, what appeared to be transport tickets, and images of luggage and preparation. A family planning a journey. And then, toward the end of the files, something that made Riley's blood run cold. Images of destruction, a ship, or what remained of one, scattered across space in pieces. Emergency response vessels surrounding the debris field, official reports stamped with accident investigation codes. The girl made a soft, wounded sound as those images appeared. She pressed her face against Riley's shoulder again, unable to look at visual confirmation of catastrophe. Riley closed the file, her mind reeling. A transport accident. That was what she was seeing. The girl's family had died in a ship disaster, and somehow this child had survived. But then why was she alone on the station? Where were the emergency services? Why hadn't someone taken responsibility for a surviving minor? She navigated to the station's public information network, searching recent news feeds. It took several queries, but eventually she found it. A transport accident 2 weeks ago involving a commercial liner that had suffered catastrophic engine failure during approach to Gateway 7. 73 casualties confirmed. 12 survivors, all adults currently recovering in station medical facilities. No mention of a child survivor. No indication that anyone was searching for a missing juvenile from that incident. Riley felt anger kindling beneath her concern. How does a child get lost in the aftermath of a disaster? How does someone this small slip through every safety net that should have existed? The answer, she realized with growing fury, was probably bureaucratic in the worst way. The girl had likely been processed through emergency medical, found to be physically unharmed, and then, what? Released to the care of embassy officials who never showed up, placed in temporary housing that somehow failed to materialize, shuffled between departments until she simply fell through the cracks? Riley had seen similar failures in Earth's social systems. She had lived them as a child. The galaxy was larger, the systems more complex, but bureaucratic failure remained universal. Forms unfiled, communications missed, individuals reduced to case numbers that could be lost in administrative transitions. This girl had survived an accident that killed her family, only to be abandoned a second time by the very systems designed to protect her. Not anymore, Riley said aloud, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. The child looked up at her questioningly. Riley saved the chip's contents to her secure personal storage, then carefully returned the physical chip to the girl's bundle. She helped the child rewrap the precious item, understanding now why she guarded it so fiercely. It contained the only remaining evidence of her family's existence. "Listen to me," Riley said, crouching to the girl's eye level and taking both small hands in hers. "I don't know if you can understand all my words, but I need you to hear this. You're not alone anymore. Do you understand? Not alone." She repeated the phrase using the translation tablet, selecting the concepts for together and safety and family. The device did its best to render these in Kerethi-compatible formats. The girl's enormous eyes searched Riley's face, looking for truth or deception, promise or another betrayal. Whatever she saw there caused something to shift in her expression. She launched herself forward, wrapping small arms around Riley's neck with desperate strength. Riley held her, feeling the small body shake with emotion. Not just grief this time, but something else. Relief, maybe, or the beginning of hope. They stayed that way while Gateway Station 7 continued its endless rotation around them, while thousands of beings moved through their daily routines, completely unaware of the promise being made in a small maintenance workshop. Riley knew her decision carried consequences she couldn't fully anticipate. She knew that keeping this child, because that was what she was deciding, she realized, would complicate her carefully constructed solitary life in ways that probably wouldn't all be comfortable. But sometimes the right thing and the easy thing weren't the same. Sometimes broken things needed more than technical repairs. They needed someone willing to hold them together while they healed. Riley had learned that from the Ortegas, from the family who had seen a difficult, damaged teenager and decided she was worth the effort. Now, it was her turn to be that person for someone else. "Okay," she said softly, making a promise to the small being in her arms. "Okay, we'll figure this out together. I've got you, little one. I've got you." The girl didn't understand all the words, but she understood the tone, the gentle strength of the embrace, the commitment in Riley's voice. She burrowed closer, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, impossibly, she had found safety in the vastness of an uncaring station. Outside the maintenance bay, the stars wheeled overhead, distant and cold. But inside, two beings from different worlds began the slow, uncertain work of building something that looked remarkably like family. Over the following hours, Riley began establishing something resembling routine with her unexpected charge. The girl. Riley desperately needed a name to call her, but that would require more sophisticated communication than they currently possessed. Stayed close to Riley's side, rarely venturing more than a few meters away. She watched with fascination as Riley worked on various repairs, occasionally handing tools when Riley pointed to what she needed. The child learned quickly. Within 2 hours, she had memorized which tools were which, fetching the correct implement before Riley had to specify. She seemed to find comfort in the routine of mechanical work, in the logical progression of disassembly, diagnosis, and repair. It reminded Riley of herself at a young age, finding solace in the predictable world of how things worked, while the unpredictable world of people remained threatening. Riley fabricated a makeshift bed in the workshop's storage area, stacking emergency cushions to create something more comfortable than the chair. She showed it to the girl, who approached cautiously but ultimately approved, testing its softness with careful hands. Riley added blankets and, on impulse, retrieved a small portable light from her supplies, something the child could control herself, maintaining power over at least one aspect of her environment. Food was easier than expected. The processing unit's Karethi protocols worked well, producing meals the girl consumed with the same controlled hunger she had shown initially. Riley made sure to offer food regularly, establishing that sustenance wasn't scarce or contingent on good behavior. Each meal seemed to relax the child a little more, building trust through the simple act of consistent care. Communication improved incrementally. Riley discovered that the girl could read basic galactic standard pictographs. She must have been in early education before the accident. Using this foundation, they developed a limited but functional vocabulary through the translation tablet. The child could express basic needs, confirm understanding, and even ask simple questions. By the end of the first day cycle, they had established something remarkable: mutual understanding, not complete, not sophisticated, but real. The girl knew that Riley's workshop was safe space. She understood that food and water were freely available. She recognized that Riley wouldn't leave her alone, and Riley learned the girl's name after a fashion. The child touched her own chest and made a sound that Riley's human vocal cords couldn't quite replicate, something between Sela and Shira, with harmonic overtones her throat couldn't produce. Riley tried several times, getting closer but never quite accurate. The girl seemed to find this amusing rather than frustrating, her first hint of something that might become a smile flickering across her features. Sarah, Riley finally settled on, the closest approximation her human phonemes could manage. Is that okay? Can I call you Sarah? The girl, Sarah, considered this, then nodded acceptance. It wasn't her name, not exactly, but it was close enough to honor her identity while acknowledging the limitations of cross-species communication. Sarah, Riley repeated, smiling. It's nice to meet you, Sarah, officially. Sarah touched Riley's arm, then pointed to the mechanic questioningly. Riley, she said, pointing to herself. My name is Riley. Sarah attempted the name, her Karethi vocal structure rendering it as something like Riley, with a subtle harmonic that made it sound almost musical, close enough for mutual understanding. That evening's cycle, Riley had long since stopped tracking station time in favor of personal rhythms. She faced the decision she had been avoiding. The communication terminal sat at her workbench, its interface innocently awaiting input. She should contact station authorities, should report finding Sarah, should activate the official processes for dealing with unaccompanied minors. But every time she considered making that call, she looked at Sarah, currently curled in her makeshift bed, clutching her precious bundle, finally sleeping peacefully after probably weeks of fear and instability. She thought about what would happen if she reported this. Sarah would be taken into official custody. There would be investigations, interviews through translators, documentation and processing. Best case scenario, they would locate Karethi relatives willing to take her. Worst case, she would enter the foster system equivalent, institutional care on a Karethi world, or more likely, in one of the Council's collective facilities for orphaned minors. Riley had researched those facilities once, out of professional curiosity about how different cultures handled social services. They were adequate, properly funded, staffed by trained professionals. They were also impersonal, overcrowded, and operated on the principle of meeting basic needs rather than providing actual families. She couldn't do it, couldn't make that call, couldn't consign Sarah to a system that would care for her body while ignoring her heart. Instead, Riley opened a different interface, her personal legal access portal. She began researching guardianship protocols, the legal frameworks that governed care of minors across species boundaries. It was complex, designed primarily for situations where adult relatives from different species took responsibility for juveniles. But there were provisions for unrelated guardianship, particularly in cases where traditional family structures weren't available. The process wasn't simple. It required extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, home studies, and approval from both human authorities and the Karethi embassy. It took minimum 6 months, often longer. And it required the child's consent, demonstrated through age-appropriate communication assessment. 6 months, Riley thought. 6 months of Sarah living in institutional care while bureaucrats processed forms. 6 months of the girl wondering if this was another abandonment, another betrayal by adults who promised safety. Or 6 months of Sarah staying here in the workshop while Riley navigated the legal process. It wasn't strictly legal. There were supposed to be supervised placements during evaluation periods, but Riley was already violating protocol by not reporting Sarah's presence immediately. What was a few more regulations broken in service of doing the right thing? She initiated the guardianship application, filling in her information with steady determination. When it asked for the minor's current location, she listed her workshop address. Let them come investigate if they wanted. By then, she would have established enough evidence of appropriate care that separating them would be harder to justify. Riley submitted the application and received an automated acknowledgement. Initial review would take 3 to 5 business days. Then the real process would begin. 3 to 5 days, Riley thought. She could manage that, could keep Sarah safe and cared for while the administrative machinery slowly awakened. And if station authorities came asking questions before then, well, she would deal with that when it happened. She closed the terminal and moved to check on Sarah. The child slept deeply. Her small body finally relaxed in genuine rest rather than exhausted collapse. Riley adjusted the blankets, careful not to wake her, and felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. This was what family felt like, she realized. Not the procedural assignment of relatives through legal documents, but the choice to care, the decision to show up, the commitment to be present regardless of complications. The Ortegas had taught her that, had demonstrated through years of patience and love, that family was built through daily acts of choosing each other. Now, Riley was choosing Sarah, and based on how tightly the girl had gripped her hand, how she sought Riley's presence for comfort, how she had offered the precious memory chip with trust that transcended language barriers, Sarah was choosing Riley right back. "We're going to be okay," Riley whispered to the sleeping child. "I don't know exactly how yet, but we're going to figure it out, together." Sarah shifted slightly in her sleep, a soft sound escaping her that might have been contentment. Riley smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, the weight of responsibility that came not from duty, but from love. Outside the maintenance bay, Gateway Station 7 continued its eternal rotation, thousands of lives intersecting in millions of moments. But in that small workshop, in the space between broken machinery and careful repairs, 2 beings from different worlds had found each other, and neither of them was alone anymore. Epilogue. 6 months later, Riley Ortega stood in the observation deck of Gateway Station 7, a small blue-grey hand clasped firmly in hers. Sarah pressed against her side, no longer from fear but from comfortable familiarity, watching the stars wheel past the massive viewport with wonder rather than trauma in her eyes. The guardianship approval had come through 2 weeks ago, after months of evaluations, interviews, and more bureaucratic hurdles than Riley had imagined possible. The Karethi embassy officials had been skeptical initially, questioning whether a human could adequately raise a Karethi child, whether cultural traditions would be maintained, whether Sarah would lose connection to her heritage. But Sarah herself had been the deciding factor. When the final interview came, conducted through skilled translators with the girl's comfort prioritized, she had been adamant. She chose Riley, chose this strange human who had found her crying in a corridor and refused to abandon her to the machinery of systems that moved efficiently but cared impersonally. The workshop had been transformed over those months, still a repair space. Riley's work continued, and Sarah had proven to be an excellent assistant, learning the fundamentals of mechanical engineering with the enthusiasm of a child who finally felt secure enough to be curious about the world. But now there was also a proper sleeping area, partitioned off for privacy, educational materials appropriate for a Karethi child her age, connections to other Karethi families on the station, ensuring Sarah maintained cultural ties and language practice. Riley had worried about that, about whether she could be enough, whether one human could provide everything a child needed when that child came from a completely different world. But the embassy counselor had reminded her of something important. No parent, regardless of species, could be everything their child needed. The goal wasn't perfection, but presence, not comprehensive expertise, but comprehensive love. And love, Riley had discovered, transcended species barriers more effectively than any translation technology. "Riley," Sarah said, tugging on Riley's hand and pointing to a transport ship docking in the distance. Her galactic standard had improved dramatically, supplemented by the Karethi she practiced with her cultural tutors. "Big one. Cargo." "Cargo ship, yes," Riley confirmed. "Probably bringing supplies from the inner colonies. Want to guess what kind?" This had become their game, identifying ships by their configurations, speculating about their purposes. Sarah had developed an engineer's eye for mechanical detail, could often determine a vessel's function from its external structure. "Food synthesizers," Sarah declared after careful study. "The cargo bay is temperature-controlled. See the external cooling arrays." "Good eye," Riley praised, ruffling the space between Sarah's small horns, a gesture the girl loved, equivalent to affection in Karethi body language. "You're going to be a better engineer than me someday," Sarah beamed, her bioluminescent markings brightening with pride. Then her expression shifted to something more thoughtful. "Tell again? The finding day?" Riley smiled. Sarah asked for this story regularly, seemed to need the reinforcement of how they had come together. Riley understood. She had done the same thing as a child with the Ortegas, asking repeatedly to hear about the day they decided to adopt her, needing the confirmation that she had been chosen, wanted, kept. "I was working in my shop," Riley began, settling into the familiar narrative. "Just a normal day, fixing broken things like always. And then I heard someone crying." "Me," Sarah interjected as she always did. "You," Riley agreed. "A little girl who was very scared, very sad, very alone. And I thought, that's something broken that needs fixing." "I wasn't broken," Sarah protested, also part of the ritual. "No," Riley said seriously, pulling the girl closer. "You weren't broken. You were hurt, and you needed someone to care. That's different. You were always whole, Sarah. You just needed someone to see it." Sarah nestled against Riley's side, satisfied with this answer. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the infinite expanse of space stretch before them. Riley thought about that day 6 months ago, about the choice she had made to stop and listen to crying in a corridor, to extend a hand to a frightened child instead of walking past like everyone else had. It had seemed like a small thing at the time, basic compassion, basic humanity. But that small choice had transformed both their lives in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She had come to space to escape connection, to exist in the clean simplicity of mechanical problems and technical solutions. Instead, she had found family in the last place she expected, in a small alien girl who needed exactly what Riley had once needed, someone willing to stay. "Love you, Riley," Sarah said quietly, the words still somewhat awkward in standard, but clear in their sincerity. Riley's chest tightened with emotion. "Love you too, kiddo," she replied. "Always." They stood together on the observation deck, Human and Karithi, mechanic and apprentice, parent and child. Different species, different worlds, different languages, but connected by something more fundamental than biology or culture. The simple choice to care, to show up, to hold someone's hand when they needed it most. Below them, Gateway Station 7 continued its endless rotation, a crossroads where countless beings intersected for brief moments before moving on to separate destinies. But in this moment, in this observation deck, two beings who had found each other in the vastness of space stood together, watching the stars, and neither of them was alone anymore. Thank you so much for watching this story. If it touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below with where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world. Until the next story, take care of each other out there.